Police in Connecticut begin to suspect a missing woman was murdered. But how can they prove it when they haven't got the body? After a 14-year search, a skeleton is found in a well. Is there enough left to determine what happened? A homicide investigation stalls until a dead man helps solve the mystery of his son's disappearance. Hiding the victim used to be the key to getting away with murder, but no longer. Even without a body, forensics can tear the fabric of lies and expose the bodies of evidence. A dead body. It's usually the first clue in a homicide. But without a victim, how can police catch the killer? Without a victim, how can they prove a murder occurred at all? In December 1986, Connecticut State Police were faced with just such a challenge. Hella Crafts, a 38-year-old flight attendant, had disappeared from her home in quiet Newtown, Connecticut. She left behind her husband Richard and 3 children. Her disappearance came as no surprise to Richard. Hella had recently filed for divorce after discovering he was having an affair. The Crafts' nanny, Marie Thomas, was worried. Her suspicions grew when she noticed stains on the carpet near Hella's side of the bed. She called Hella's best friend, who in turn contacted Hella's lawyer. According to State Police Detective Joseph DeStefano, Hella may have feared for her life.
Hella explained to her attorney that if for some reason she disappeared or wasn't around any longer or something wasn't right, and not to take it as being a coincidence, that there was something wrong. And she had asked her attorney, please look into it. That is exactly what had happened. Hella did disappear.
Police questioned Richard Crafts. Though they knew his situation with Hella was rocky, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Besides his day job as a commercial airline pilot, Richard was a town constable, sworn to uphold the law. But as state investigators talked to Hella's friends, suspicions about Richard began to grow.
When people were asking Richard where Hella was, he gave several different answers. At one point he said she was visiting her mother. At another point I believe he said she was visiting her sister. At another point he said he didn't know where she was. Things that weren't consistent with what a husband would say if his wife was missing. That in itself created some suspicion.
Police had enough information to obtain a search warrant of Kraft's house, but not enough to charge Richard with any crime. They still didn't know if this was a criminal investigation or a wild goose chase.
At this point in time, we had no answers. All we had were questions.
They hoped to find some answers in the Kraft's bedroom. By the time they obtained the warrant, the room was virtually empty, apparently to get ready for new carpeting, but perhaps also to disrupt the crime scene. Meanwhile, Richard was on his way to Florida for Christmas and miles ahead of the police. Something happened here, but had the suspect erased all the evidence? Some of the furniture was discovered in the basement. Before investigators could examine the bedroom, they called in a friend of Hella's to tell them how it was arranged. After the room was back in order, the forensics team found stains on one side of the mattress. Blood spatter expert Henry Lee was called in to interpret them.
The first time when you hit somebody, usually don't produce spatter. You only can create a wound. When the blood starts deposit around the injury area, from the capillary or a vein, now you have pool of blood. The second time you hit it, then you have spatter.
Lee was able to determine from the size and distance the stains spread on the mattress that the blood spattered at medium velocity. That told him a little about the weapon.
We know it's some blunt object, but I cannot tell you that's a hammer, an axe, or flashlight. Could be any type of this blunt object.
One thing Lee and investigators concurred on. They had found the crime scene, and it suggested bloody murder. A faint pattern of blood on Hella and Richard Kraft's mattress was enough to turn up the heat on what was, until then, a missing persons investigation. Now, police felt that Hella might be dead, and that Richard Krafts had killed her. But the proof was scant, shaky. They were relying more on instinct than evidence. If Mrs. Krafts was killed, where was her body? They'd have to do their homework.
The next level of the investigation was a review of paperwork that we had found in Mr. Kraft's background, particularly his credit card receipts.
On the roster of routine purchases, one line stood out.
We found that Richard Krafts had rented a wood chipper from the Darien Rental Agency in Darien, Connecticut.
Though it seemed like a shot in the dark, DeStefano's sergeant suggested that perhaps Krafts used a wood chipper to eliminate the body. DeStefano was skeptical.
My immediate thought was things like that don't happen. They happen on television, but they don't happen in real life.
He went to Darien Rental to see if it was even possible to use a wood chipper to dispose of a body. The rental agent showed him the chipper that Richard Krafts rented on November 18th, around the same date Hella Krafts disappeared.
Okay, essentially what we have then, we've got all the material being fed in through this end.
Right.
And it's coming in contact with the cutters on the wheel over here.
Yeah, which is spinning.
Now, about how thick is that wheel? About 2 inches?
2 inches, yes, sir.
And that's solid steel.
Yeah, it weighs about 900 pounds.
900 pounds. Those blades, one on either side. So once that wheel gets moving, nothing stops it.
No, not at all.
The only thing that happens is whatever hits that gets cut.
Yeah, you could throw a piece of steel in there, it wouldn't make any difference. It would cut it up.
You say that opens up about 12 inches?
About 12
right
inches,
here?
yeah.
So 1,200 RPMs with a 900-pound piece of metal, two 12-inch blades. No way anything's going to stop that.
Not at all.
Though the massive blade could make short work of anything in its path, the hopper could only accommodate objects up to a foot wide. It would be impractical to dispose of a body that way, but not impossible. It seemed far-fetched. But while DeStefano was investigating the wood chipper, other detectives spoke with town workers to see if anyone had seen anything that might resemble a clue. A utility worker reported he was out in the early morning of November 19th. He saw someone operating what looked to be a wood chipper on River Road, adjacent to the Housatonic River. That chance observation propelled an otherwise stalled investigation. Attention shifted to River Road.
When the investigators got to that location, they did in fact find wood chips on the ground. In exploring the area all the more, they found envelopes with Hella Kraft's return address on them. At this point in time, we had the feeling that we've got something here that's totally out of the ordinary.
Investigators gathered 33 bags of debris from the River Road area. The bags were sent to the police station to be pored over piece by piece. Anything that wasn't a wood chip or a leaf was set aside.
At first we would find one hair, and not knowing what to do with it, we took a bottle, and we put the one hair in the bottle. We would continue on. We'd find an object that was harder than wood, but softer than stone. So we felt that we'll start another bottle for items such as these.
Out of the mulch, a grisly scenario was taking shape. Based on these initial findings, a tent was set up to process evidence on site. Konstantin Karazoulis, the state's chief forensic odontologist, or dental expert, was called in hopes of locating human dental remains.
We would collect evidence and bring it into a tent, and we would put it through some water, through a filter, and look for things that were human parts.
Circumstantial evidence was piling up. The blood in the bedroom, the wood chipper rental, the unidentified fragments in the wood chips. But there was still no body, and without a body, there was no crime. They needed to find something more definite. Investigators knew they had to turn the case around, or a killer would walk. While evidence of a crime was turning up along River Road, police continued interviewing potential witnesses. One spotted a man with a wood chipper on November 19th on a bridge about a mile south of the River Road site. Divers were sent to the bridge to see what they could recover. The water under a bridge is the repository of all things broken and discarded. It's a dumping ground for vandals, and a place where unwanted possessions are tossed and forgotten. Most are mundane, but sometimes the unexpected turns up. Dan Lewis was one of the divers.
What we were looking for was anything that could have been used as a weapon. We were looking for any type of a container, and certainly any more body fragments. Underneath this bridge, there's many parking meters, road signs, shopping carts, the usual kind of things that you'll find discarded off of a bridge. I mean, something like a chainsaw or type of weapon will be totally out of place. When they came up with that, we immediately knew that we may have something here that pertained to that case.
Like everything else in this case, the chainsaw's connection was tenuous. The tool was sent to Dr. Lee's lab to see if a link could be made. Meanwhile, a mile north at the tent, Detective DeStefano was making a gruesome discovery of his own.
I had just put some debris into the screen. I had rinsed it off, and my normal course was after I would rinse, I would go through it with my fingers just to make sure that it was totally rinsed. As I was going through, you develop a certain feel for what you're dealing with, and wood chips have a certain consistency about them. As I went through, I felt something that didn't feel like a wood chip. It felt slippery. And when I held it under the light, I found it to be the tip of a finger.
The evidence of the crime was becoming ever more apparent, but it still wasn't strong enough to prove Hella's murder or to name her killer. The pieces would start to come together in Lee's lab as the chainsaw was studied.
The chainsaw deposit in the river must have a reason. We initially don't know what's the significance and the linkage. But by examining the chainsaw, we found tiny fragment of hair. Under a higher power magnification, microscopic examination, we made a determination that's human. Not only human, we noticed this hair was bleached and dyed.
To Lee's assistant, Elaine Pagliaro, the bleached and dyed hairs were all too familiar. Over 2,000 of them had already been recovered from the wood chips and examined.
The roots were of something we call paintbrush type. This paintbrush appearance to a root is characteristically found when hair is in tissue, and then that tissue starts to putrefy. and the chemicals from the putrefaction affect the appearance of the hair root. So it ends up looking just like a paintbrush. That's important in an investigation such as the Crafts case because it indicates that the hair was in tissue and wasn't from a beauty parlor and dumped alongside the road.
The hairs were then compared to hair from the victim's hairbrush recovered from the Crafts house. They matched. The chainsaw was then taken apart. Inside the housing were blue-green cloth fibers and remnants of flesh and blood. The fibers were the same color and fabric as Hella's nightclothes. The flesh in the chainsaw proved to be human, and the blood type matched Hella Crafts. Now it was a matter of finding out who the chainsaw belonged to. The serial number was corroded from being underwater, but Elaine Pagliaro was able to restore it.
Because of the nature of the way metal is formed, the impression goes through several layers. So even if you scrape off the top layer, if you take away that scraped portion, you should be able to raise up the impressed areas below.
She applied a chemical to the surface of the plate, which dissolved the corroded layers of metal, revealing the serial number.
The number is E5921616. All my career, I remember that number.
The serial number was traced back to the dealership. The chainsaw had been purchased by Richard Crafts. The forensics on the chainsaw potentially linked victim and killer, but investigators still had to prove that Hella Crafts was truly dead. After combing the banks of the River Road site for more than a week, Dr. Karazoulis found the final piece of the puzzle.
And as I looked down, I noticed there was an object. And that object turned out to be a human tooth.
In forensics, this is the Holy Grail.
I knew I had everything that I would need to make an identification of a human being.
A comparison with dental records proved the tooth belonged to Hella Crafts. But it suggested more than that. Part of the jawbone was still clinging to the tooth, and part of the root was cut off.
If this tooth were just removed, you wouldn't see this type of a fracture, or you wouldn't see bone attached to it in this way. So I believe that some force broke this tooth from its seat in the jaw and crushed whatever it was holding to pieces.
That force could have been a chainsaw or a wood chipper. Richard Crafts could be connected to both objects, and now indisputably to the victim, his wife, Hella Crafts. The circle was closing in on the airline pilot. The condition of the tooth, coupled with the hair and skin evidence, was enough to allow the medical examiner to declare Hella Crafts dead, 2 months after she disappeared. Based on the trail of evidence, police reconstructed the likely scenario of Hella Crafts' death. On the night of November 18th, Hella was preparing for bed when Richard struck her with a blunt object. He got rid of the bloody sheets, but left telltale stains on the mattress and carpet. He had already rented the wood chipper, probably for some legitimate purpose. Then he realized he had the opportunity to kill his wife and use the chipper to dispose of her body. But he knew the opening in the machine wasn't wide enough to fit a human torso. That's where the chainsaw came in.
This isn't something that you would do to an animal. It's just not something that you do. I mean, it's totally beyond the realm of what people do to each other.
Only 6 ounces of material from Hella Craft's remains was ever recovered. Less than 1/1000th of a human body. But it was enough for the police to make their case.
Most people don't realize 2 things. Number one, the lengths to which the police will go to investigate a crime. And number 2, the power of forensics. They don't realize the new developments that have happened within the past few years that have revolutionized forensics in criminal investigation. It's incredible what can be done now when you blend science with investigation.
For his crime, Richard Crafts received a 50-year sentence. His unconventional way of disposing of the body proved to be his undoing, though it took a battery of forensics experts to prove it. But not everyone has access to those resources. One woman's desperate search for her sister would consume 14 years of her life. Ava D Hart was looking for a good time, but she fell in with a bad crowd. Her circle of friends was a motley group of biker wannabes, a touch of menace in the otherwise sleepy riverside town of Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1982. They hung out at a place called the Joker's Wild, a loose-knit gang with too much time on their hands. Ava's boyfriend was the leader of the group. His name was George Pasalis, but he called himself George Sparta. He was a man who was more feared than respected. Ava had dated him for 8 years. During that time, their relationship grew more abusive. Occasionally, she'd leave him, but never for long. On July 20th, 1982, Ava left her house to go to work at the Joker's Wild. That was the last anyone ever saw of her. After a day had gone by with no sign of Ava, her family contacted the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. Detective Billy Bowler explains the investigation.
When the investigation was first initiated, it was a missing persons report, and our sheriff at the time was chief of detectives and picked up the case. He followed through with, interviewed the family. He went to interview Pat Salas. Pat Salas produces a handwritten letter that was confirmed through family members that it was in her handwriting, more or less a Dear John type letter. I'm leaving, they had a spat, see you later, that kind of thing. I'm not coming back.
If George knew where Ava had gone, he wasn't telling. Neither was anyone else. With no leads and no clear signs of foul play, the sheriff's investigation could go no further.
I think Pat Salas, of course, was targeted as a suspect or an individual responsible right from Jump Street, but they had no one coming forward with any information. There was no, we had no body, we had no forensic evidence, we had no Ava D Hart.
And Ava's family had no consolation. Ava's sister Debbie suspected a conspiracy of silence among the gang at the Joker's Wild. She felt the police weren't taking the case seriously. She knew that if Ava was to be found, she'd have to go it alone.
The attitude was a bit hard to deal with in the beginning because I would take them a rumor that I heard or someone that said something, and they would contact me again and tell me they'd followed up on it, and then we'd go through this cycle, this whole roller coaster, emotional roller coaster of going to them and giving them information and then having nothing come of it. And it was very difficult to deal with.
Debbie was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Desperate to find her little sister, she bulldogged every member of the Joker's Wild gang, pumping them for information, taking copious notes. She knew her only hope lay with the surly gang of bikers who said they were Ava's friends. But no one would talk. They were all afraid of George Patsalos. The weeks unfolded into years, but Debbie endured, even though she was forced to realize her sister was probably dead.
My friends say that when I get resolve on an issue, that I don't let go. And I guess I'd wavered in my own heart and mind many times about what I always knew that she was dead, but I'd wavered in my own mind about what could have happened.
In 1996, a news story caught Debbie's eye. A story about a woman in a footlocker. Her remains were found in Frederick, Maryland in 1982, the same year that Ava disappeared. Identification techniques weren't as sophisticated then.
The body had been misidentified, and the new identification was a young girl, 22 to 26, the right height, the right weight. She was found within 4 weeks of my sister's disappearance and had been missing been in the trunk approximately for 4 to 6 weeks. And so I just really had a very emotional response to that.
The search for her sister would lead her to the largest collection of anatomical remains in the United States. In April 1996, renowned forensic authority Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington applied his expertise to putting a face on the lady in the trunk.
Well, that was then printed in the papers, and it turned out that Debbie Dehart, the sister of Ava Dehart, happened to see that in the newspapers, and she thought, could that possibly be Ava? Because Ava had disappeared in 1982.
Encouraged by the preliminary description of the lady in the trunk, Debbie acquired Ava's dental records so Owsley could compare them. But sadly, the dental work didn't match. The lady in the trunk was not Ava D Hart. Debbie D Hart's quest showed no sign of ending, but the lady in the trunk provided some unexpected help after all.
There was so much publicity surrounding it. There were TV people and media people pursuing me, and I did some interviews. And as a result of that, I started to get phone calls. People were interested again. And I got some anonymous calls, people with little bits and pieces of information, but information I had needed all along.
After 14 years of pushing, Debbie finally felt like she was making progress. She knew this could be her last chance. She hired private investigator Al Baker to help her follow up with the former members of the Joker's Wild gang.
We began making contact with various people, which Debbie was able to provide us with the names. She had done that thorough job as to know who was part of this group, how we could contact most of them.
Nobody knew anything definite. Many were still afraid of George Patsalos. But one name kept coming up, Barbara Campfield, the woman who became Patsalos' girlfriend after Ava and who eventually married him. One woman in particular said she helped Campfield clean up some blood at the Joker's Wild after Ava's disappearance. At the time, Campfield told her that the blood was the result of a fight. It seemed that Barbara Campfield knew something. But what? Debbie had already tried speaking with her, but got nowhere. Now Baker gave it a try.
I started off by introducing myself to her, providing her my card, giving her phone numbers, and calmly explaining to her that we were now in the investigation with the D Hart family and that we were not going away, that this investigation would continue, was not going to stop, and we were going to talk to everybody we could to try and find out where Ava was.
Baker kept pursuing Campfield. Realizing that Baker wasn't going to let up, she was persuaded to work out a deal. She began cooperating with Detective Bowler and the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. She directed them to an abandoned home site outside of town. Campfield told Bowler that on the night Ava disappeared, George Patsalos asked Campfield to help him dump something heavy down a well. He told her not to ask any questions. She never dared to.
The well was pointed out to us. We subsequently got a search warrant for the property, went there with the assistance of the state police and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and called the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue folks to come help us actually in the excavation of the well.
After making sure the conditions were safe, the fire and rescue workers were slowly lowered into the claustrophobic depths of the well. The hole was less than 2 feet square and 19 feet deep. Soon, the workers were hauling up buckets of soil and debris, years of accumulated leaves and dirt that concealed whatever lay below. Then bones started coming out. They were laid on the ground beside the well so an anthropologist could see what they'd found and what was missing. It was clear the bones were human and female.
We found pretty much probably the best part of her whole skeleton in various pieces and forms as we brought those out. Really, they came out in 5-gallon bucket fulls at a time out of the well.
It seemed the mystery of Ava's disappearance had been solved. But were these truly her remains? A comparison of the jaw with Ava's dental records confirmed the terrible yet reassuring truth. Debbie Dehart's sister had been found.
Well, it's certainly better for us to have found her than to have never found her. I don't think we realized how deep the wound was or how it would never heal if we hadn't found her.
For the Deharts, and in the name of justice, Owsley was entrusted with determining how Ava had died.
My role is to state what the facts are. And to do that, what you have to do is pay very careful attention to the skeleton, to the bones. And if you know how to read the bones, they just are, it's phenomenal what they can tell you. This particular skeleton of Ava Dehart, it tells you exactly what happened to her, and it also provides all of the clues that helped with the determination of her identification.
Owsley studied every inch, scrutinized every fracture to try to determine the cause of death. Was she murdered elsewhere, then dumped in the well? Was she killed by the 19-foot drop? Or was she still alive, trapped, and left to die? The injuries caused by the fall were restricted to the lower half of her body.
Fractures in the foot, the lower leg bones, the thigh bones, and the pelvis are the result of being dropped in the well. When she was dropped in the well, her feet hit the bottom, and that caused breakage of some of the bone. As the force goes up the shin bone, then it causes jamming at the knee joint. And in relation to this, then when you look at the distal end of the femur, these fit together like this, the force compresses into the distal end of the femur, and it causes this compression fracturing right here.
From the condition of her remains, Owsley determined that Ava was probably dead before she was thrown into the well.
This blow to the midface, where it actually broke 4 bones. It broke part of the right maxilla, the left maxilla, and both nasal bones. It just sheared the nasal bones off. And that's telling you that it's coming from her right to left, but it's also going up because there's a slight oblique angle here in the nasal bones. There's no sign of a tool or any being hit with a specific type of weapon. This is something that apparently was done with a fist.
There was not a part of the skeleton that didn't have some type of injury.
It was savage. That's the only way that you can classify it, because I think even the blow to the face would knock most people out. He was simply out to kill the girl.
George Patsalos, now living in Florida, was charged with the murder of Ava Dehart. At the trial, Owsley presented Ava's remains to the jury. Through his forensic interpretation, she was able to testify against her killer.
I think that Doug felt that the dramatic way that she died, that she would speak to the jury, that it would be Ava telling the jury look what happened to me. And I believe the Commonwealth's attorney used those exact words. Look what happened to me.
On October 8, 1997, George Patsalos was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. The case against Patsalos was solved through forensics, detective work, and second-hand accounts. But suppose a crime had no witnesses, no crime scene, and no trace of a body. In April 1992, a 13-year-old Chevette was towed into an impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. There, it joined the ranks of other abandoned vehicles, awaiting their date with the crusher. At the time, no one knew it, but this car held a terrible secret.
Got it. Go, John.
Everyone in New Albany, Indiana, knew that Eric Humbert and Jonathan Whitesides were the best of friends.
I'll follow you over there. All right, man. Hey, next game.
They worked together in the U.S. Geological Survey, and they played together after work and on the weekends. So it only seemed fitting that John Whitesides was the last person to see Eric Humbert alive. On the evening of January 15, 1991, after a game of hoops with their co-workers, the two drove to the auto shop to drop Whiteside's truck off for repairs before heading home. But by 9:30 that night, Humbert still hadn't arrived at his house. Eric's wife, Missy, said she phoned Whitesides to see if he'd seen him. Whitesides told her Eric had left just a few minutes ago and assured her he'd be arriving home any minute. But the minutes turned to hours. At 2 a.m., Missy called Whitesides again. Eric still wasn't home, and she was worried. Jonathan said he'd be right over. Eric never returned. Though Missy had spoken to the police the day after Eric disappeared, she didn't file an official missing persons report until 2 weeks later. Their relationship was becoming strained, and she thought Eric may just have wanted a little time by himself. But now she felt something terrible had happened. Eric was gone too long. He wouldn't have left his 18-month-old son. That wasn't like him. Detective Keith Whitlow of the New Albany Police led the investigation.
We began interviewing co-workers. There was rumors that Eric may have had a girlfriend in another state. We checked with that person, and she hadn't seen Eric. So his disappearance was pretty mysterious to everyone. Not only was he gone, but also was his automobile. There was without a trace.
But something of interest did come from interviewing Missy's co-workers. Many said that Jonathan frequently picked her up at work. Some claimed that Jonathan and Missy were having an affair. Suspicions centered around Jonathan Whitesides, but there was not the slightest evidence that anything illegal had happened, nothing to link him to any wrongdoing. The two may have been guilty of indiscretion, but there's no law against that. Months went by. It seemed the earth had swallowed up Eric Humbert and his car. Meanwhile, Whitesides moved in with Missy and her son. Then, in April, 4 months after Eric was reported missing, a white Chevette turned up in a state impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. Unclaimed, it was about to be sold or scrapped.
But they decided, as a matter of routine, to make one last check with the National Crime Information Center to see if this car was in fact stolen and whether they could have located an owner. When they did, they got a hit on the car showing that the car was part of a missing persons investigation right across the Ohio River from them in New Albany, Indiana. We were very, very close to losing a very key piece of the puzzle.
The car belonged to Eric Humbert. It was stripped of its tags. In the hatchback were traces of blood.
Hey, look at that.
Louisville detectives interviewed Whitesides, the last person to see Humbert alive.
Do you know who killed Eric Humbert?
No.
He consented to a polygraph exam.
Do you know where Eric Humbert is?
No.
He failed.
Did you kill Eric Humbert?
No.
When confronted with the results, Whitesides admitted he knew more than he let on. He told police that after the basketball game on the night Eric disappeared, the two men drove to the auto shop to drop off Whiteside's truck. Afterward, they drove to Whiteside's house to work on another car. From there, Whiteside's story took a bizarre twist.
He says that suddenly Eric went into a rage and accused him of having an affair with his wife and produced a knife, and that an altercation, a physical altercation between the two men developed there in the garage. During the scuffle, Jonathan claimed that Eric was accidentally stabbed in the throat, a wound which, according to Jonathan, proved to be fatal.
Jonathan panicked. He thought nobody would believe the freak accident. He loaded the body into the back of the Chevette, drove several miles to a remote spot on the Ohio River, and dumped it in. He couldn't recall exactly where he unloaded it. The police were skeptical of Whiteside's tale. After his statement, he was arrested while they checked out his story.
It just didn't pan out. It just didn't seem logical. We even had officers simulate the combat that he had described, and we found it very difficult to believe that it happened the way that he said that it did.
Unless the body turned up, the only physical evidence to prove or refute Whiteside's story was the blood-stained Chevette. The stains in the hatchback were consistent with a wounded body being stashed there. But one feature stood out. The trunk liner contained an unusual pattern, 5 lines of blood shaped like a chevron. Some blood-soaked object had been pressed against the liner, causing the marks. They were parallel, so they couldn't be impressions of fingers. The stain was notable, but meaningless, at least so far. Under the hood, investigators found a large spatter of blood. In it was a bright green fiber. No one could explain how it got there or what it meant. Inside the engine compartment appeared what looked like human tissue. It was sent off for analysis. Forensics expert Rod Englert was brought in to study the blood evidence. He found the fine mist of blood on the distributor cap wasn't consistent with a knife wound. He demonstrates.
What I'm going to do is take some blood here, and let's say that the end of this eyedropper is the end of a knife. And let's say that it has gone into my neck and I draw it back to maybe stab again, or I just pull it out very quickly. What it will cause is what's called cast off, and cast off is the resultant pattern that you see there. Now if you put these two together, as we have here, there's an enormous amount of difference between those two patterns.
A knife wound creates a cast-off that comes from one direction. But what Englert saw on the distributor cap was multi-directional.
And that only comes about through gunshot.
To Englert, the cloudy mist of blood clearly showed that Whitesides was lying. In Indiana, the pattern of bloodstains in Eric Humbert's Chevette raised doubts that he was stabbed in the throat. More doubts were raised at the forensics lab in Oregon, where the tissue sample collected from the engine was studied by Ray Grimsboe. Microscopic analysis revealed the tissue was human, but it wasn't from anyone's neck.
The arrangement of the cells, how the cells stained, told us that it was brain tissue. It was not from the skin or exfoliated tissue from some other area. This was neural tissue. We had to figure out then, how does it get out of a neck wound? And logically, it couldn't happen that way.
A closer examination of the car revealed a single bullet hole concealed at the base of the windshield wiper. 2 small fragments were recovered and sent to Grimsbow. He confirmed they were fragments of a bullet and its copper jacket. But most intriguing was the single tiny green fiber clinging to the bullet. He didn't know what to make of it. One thing was certain. The car was the scene of a shooting, not a stabbing. Whiteside's story wasn't washing. Seeking the truth, investigators went to the garage at the house where Jonathan Whitesides was living. The garage where he said his friend had accidentally stabbed himself to death. The crime scene was now 4 months old. Would anything be left? At first sight, the garage looked clean. But soon, a 9mm cartridge was found. Days later, a 9mm handgun was retrieved from Whiteside's work van. It seemed Eric Humbert had been shot. The brain tissue and the trajectory of the bullet indicated he was shot in the head. But something was missing. Something didn't seem right.
Well, we don't have a lot of blood spatter. Normally when someone gets shot in the head, we get blood and gore everywhere. In this situation, we had very little. So when we were able to identify that tissue, then as coming from brain, basically, the spatter, the bullet fragment, all tended to fit together. This person probably was shot through the head. And the question became, how'd that happen without getting it everywhere? Well, the small green fiber. I think that's when the little light went on in my head that we have green fiber on this bullet. Bingo, that's why we don't have the blood. He had a cap on.
The weave pattern of the bloodied watch cap could also have made the chevron-shaped marks in the hatchback. The evidence so far was compelling and consistent. But was it enough to convince a jury the victim was truly Eric Humbert? All attempts to find a body met with failure.
Our body turned out to be a small piece of brain matter and some blood splatters.
The forensics team performed a DNA test on the blood. Problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. To go forward, they'd have to work backward. Blood relatives share similarities in their DNA. The forensics team counted on this to approximate Eric's genetic profile.
To identify Eric Humbert required just a paternity test, basically. We did a family history. We had his mother, his 2 living siblings, and his son and his wife. And so we typed them with DNA, and we took the unknown blood and the tissue from the scene, typed it.
To assure that the evidence wasn't contaminated, the DNA was tested simultaneously at 2 separate labs. The results were consistent, but investigators were still not satisfied. The forensics team needed to get DNA from both of Humbert's parents to be sure their findings were precise and irrefutable. Permission was obtained to exhume his father, who died several years earlier. DNA was extracted from his father's leg bones. The genetic codes from Humbert's father and mother were compared to the DNA from the blood in the Chevette.
We were able to show that, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this would have been consistent with a son of those 2 people.
Even without Eric Humbert's body, the prosecution had all it needed to convict Jonathan Whitesides. The prosecution alleged that on the last evening of Eric Humbert's life, he went to Jonathan Whiteside's house to help him fix his car. He may have suspected that his best friend was having an affair with his wife, but he couldn't have known how much his best friend wanted him out of the way. While Humbert leaned over his own car to show Whitesides how he'd made a similar repair in his Chevette, Whitesides pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot his friend execution style at point-blank range. He then loaded the body into the back of the car, disposed of it, and abandoned the vehicle. He thought that by eliminating the body, he'd eliminated all the evidence. He was wrong.
Whenever a criminal enters or leaves a crime scene, he always leaves something there. He always takes something with him. And I think that's very, very true. It's just today we are much more capable of finding those things that they take and leave than maybe we were just 10 years ago.
The jury deliberated only 45 minutes before finding Jonathan Whitesides guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. As for Eric Humbert, so far, his body hasn't been found.
Eric's mother told me after Jonathan was sentenced, she grabbed me by the arm and she said, please don't quit looking for him. And it's kind of ironic, every time we get information about a body found locally or something, it's like nobody has to say it, everybody goes, you know, like, I wonder if that's Eric. And not as of yet it hadn't been, but you know, we're still in some way, we're still looking.
Not too long ago, when victims went missing, killers went free. Today, the rules are changing. The laws of justice have allied with the laws of science. And even if the victim can't be found, chances are the killer will be.